Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I wanted to just continue the commentary on what Johannes and Ivo Di Gennaro's conversation evoked in me. I really appreciated everyone's comments from the first video. And I kind of pooped out towards the end last time, so we'll see how long I can go tonight. But I may have to, we may not get to the end, so I'll do another video if we don't. All right. So I will just start from share screen. Okay. Here we go.
Maybe I just read from your chapter on Descartes briefly. You say here, therefore, when we say that thinking lays the ground of thinking through itself, this means that thinking, so to speak, travels through itself, opens, builds, and follows through itself a way of thinking. In short, thinking travels through itself in order to constitute itself as a way of thinking. It's page 242. What is it then that thinking achieves, and what would be its responsibility today?
Well, you see, this is what you just read. This is like the foundation of new time, or of the modern age.
Yeah.
This is so methodical thinking. This is basically the subjectivity. Okay. So the doubt that summons thinking to achieve a point of certainty. For Descartes, this point of inception of, and also this point of freedom was this I think, which discovers itself as the foundation of all knowledge, and therefore as the foundation of the world, and also as the foundation of God. But that's the metaphysical way. That's one modality of the metaphysical way, and specifically the modern one, of accomplishing this task that we described before. Now, as we said, with Hegel and Nietzsche is somebody who, in a way, is aware of that. This metaphysical way, which depends on the fact that a difference with respect to things shows itself, this just doesn't work anymore. There is no modality, no way we can turn it anymore, because that towards which thinking transcends things doesn't show itself anymore. And only this transcending thinking, what we call thinking in the traditional philosophy, constitutes itself in this movement of transcending, which is the metaphysical movement. But if no beyond shows itself, if there is no beyond things to be attained, which the Greeks do in their way, which in the Middle Ages they do in a different way, which in modernity is done in a different way, then thinking cannot take place anymore. Thinking depends on the fact that in the first place there is
no beyond which for thinking to think. So I think what he's saying is pretty profound, right? So if our current age, right, no longer thinks, i.e. doesn't reveal that domain that keeps open the twofold, the ontological difference between being and being, the source of sense, and being and being's collapse, and in some sense beings just become the objects of science and technological method and everything that we call technicity. That thinking comes about, I think, through being addressed by a possibility of the twofold, I think is what he's maybe saying here. But there's this connection between the beyond which to think the beyond which to think. And so I think what he's saying is that there is no beyond which for us to think, genuine thinking in the philosophical sense, which I don't exactly know, really. It's funny. I don't even know if I know what thinking is in the deepest philosophical sense. This, because I know Heidegger talks a lot about this thinking and being, there being a unity. I mean, throughout history, thought and being are like butt buddies. But I don't quite know if I totally understand that. Let's find out.
This dimension beyond which calls thinking to give it, to ground it. So the first realization, which in Nietzsche is somehow already there, but in a very strange way, which is not easy to diagnose. The first thing to realize, and this is the shock that I was talking about, is this doesn't work anymore. But this doesn't work anymore means we are in a different now condition, but analogous condition, as the one in which philosophy was born. Namely, this means that we are left again, or thrown back into a dimension of senselessness, because so we just cater to basically to the empowerment of power.
Yeah.
What Nietzsche in his diagnosis calls the first nihilism. We talked about that in an earlier conversation. Now, what happens with Heidegger is just the shock of this senselessness that results from the fact that the scope of metaphysics is in a way accomplished. So there is nothing more in this scope, and the resulting senselessness is, or the shock of this, Heidegger calls this Seinsverlassenheit. His name for this senselessness is the fact that the beings are abandoned by being, and consequently man, the human being, is oblivious of being. This is, he says, this is the point of inception of his own thinking, because in the moment in which we experience this, this is already a point of freedom. This is already a lightning, an ignition. Let us take an ignition of what, if we are able to sustain that point and to stick to it and to bear it, because that's not, then that's an ignition for a thinking. And what's the nature of this thinking? The nature of this thinking is, the thing is that what thinking then can mean depends precisely on this experience, and what thinking means will have to constitute itself, and thinking will have to figure out what it is as it sticks to this, as it persists in responding to that ignition, to that igniting experience, which is that this what Heidegger calls Schrecken, shock.
Yeah.
Which is not just any shock, but precisely this shock, the shock of this, let's call it senselessness. And what Heidegger does is precisely just holding on to this, not letting loose for 60 years. And the result is what is called the Gesamtausgabe.
Where does that leave the tradition?
Well, that makes the tradition interesting, but interesting in a way that we see how it is.
Let me see if I can possibly articulate what I think I understand him to mean about this. So, well, specifically with Heidegger, saying that, okay, so metaphysics ends, on comes Nietzsche, right? And Heidegger, and I would also say Kierkegaard. And they're basically the ones who are experiencing the shock of the abandonment or the withdrawal of beings, right? And it makes sense because, you know, especially when you read Nietzsche, I feel like when I open up a book of Nietzsche, it's like he's screaming, right? It's like this person like screaming. Feel like, you know, if you want a facelift, man, just read Nietzsche. Right? The wind of the force of in which he's thrusting out, like God's dead, right? Wake up to it. This shock, right? Whereas before, within metaphysics, right? Before Nietzsche, metaphysics provided some sense of the for which to think, the beyond itself, for which thinking could think, right? And in many regards, that beyond itself was a call, you could say, it was a call from beings to be grounded in their being, right? So people could actually hear, in some sense, like somehow the world showed up as intelligible by virtue of which it was grounded in something. And so metaphysics and philosophers responded to that call by grounding it through the thinking of metaphysics. Well, at some point, boop, that shuts. Now what calls for thinking, right? And you could say it shuts, and what happens to metaphysics? Well, it actually just turns into science on some level. You could say that science basically carries out metaphysics, except for it's not understood as metaphysics, it's not understood as philosophy, it's understood as the given obviousness of the scientific method and the technological advancements, and all of that is all given by metaphysics, except for we don't. It's my understanding. If you look at it like this, it's not. We don't have to think about metaphysics. We are metaphysics now, right? We don't have to speculate about what is being and these kinds of things because the world shows up in terms of that. But we just call it science. We call it facts. We call it, you know, this kind of Cartesian universe that we're inside of, all the way down. So, what calls for thinking now? I think what he's saying is it's this shock. It's this shock that if, as he was saying, if as Heidegger stuck with it for like 60 years, right? Just this shock is where the inception for thought to begin again. And I think one of the last things that Heidegger ever said was, you know, that which is worthy of thinking is that we have yet to begun to think. Which is really, it's like what I think he said that in like his last lecture before he died.
You know, how can we imagine that we can learn what it means to think, which we have to learn for ourselves in a new way, just like that? That is not something which it just can't work like this. So what you then also have in Heidegger is learning what it means to think in the dialogue with this tradition. Why? Because that tradition is not something of which we can just, you know, leave behind. Now we recognize it as that kind of attempt to think and to hold awake, to keep us awake in thinking, of which we recognize what modality it has. So it's like it's a necessary exercise, this dialogue, both in getting us in understanding what this is, because the concepts and the categories of metaphysical thinking still dominate us completely today, notably in the domain of science.
Yeah.
So it's not something that we can throw away because we have it in our bones. So in order to know who we are and where we come from, it's necessary. And then it's also necessary as a way then to find again this kind of leap into the thinking which is now not metaphysical anymore, explicitly. So there's this kind of dialogue which is becoming a
No wonder I don't know what thinking is.
Of where we come from and what we are, which is already in the horizon of this new thinking. And this means reconstructing what Kant says, reconstructing what Hegel says, and so on. And then comes the moment in which, we can, so to speak, let go of this exercise of interpretation and go purely into this new thinking.
Go purely into this new thinking. What does he mean by that? To go purely in this new thinking. So there's one way where we need to actually grapple with the tradition, read the philosophers, right? To understand how deeply, I guess, we are metaphysics, and in realizing that, all from within the shock, right? And then he makes this distinction, jump into this new realm of thinking that isn't a dialogue with the tradition directly. I wonder what that is.
But those are two moments of the same task, which is the task of learning what it means to think and what is to be thought in the first place. And this is, Heidegger has names for this in his Beiträge zur Philosophie, for instance, when he talks about, he has words like Zuspiel, and when he talks about the relation with the tradition. But what all of this means for our relation to the tradition is that we recognize it as indispensable, and certainly not something that we can just use as a toolbox, as a, like where we can then pick our concepts then to build little devices for some kind of practical purpose.
So right. This is the thing about philosophical thinking, in my understanding, is that it's so difficult to remember this, because in fact, the difficulty in remembering it is precisely poignant to our time, right? In the time that we're in, which is, it is this sense in which to tend to that domain of sense, right? The being of beings, to keep open twofold. As it closes, so does the occurrence of the skole, right? The space-time in which one genuinely thinks closes with it, right? In other words, most often, I think even people read philosophy and write philosophy with some kind of trying to cause some kind of operative effect, right? And I think when you do that, it's interesting, what you're doing is you're taking as given a certain unthought metaphysics just in that, right? Where thinking's domain, right? I would say in some respect, art's domain, perhaps even theology's domain, is to actually think the notions of time and space themselves, right? To not just throw yourself in, like, because if you try to philosophize or think philosophically, in order to do something, right, in order to achieve something, right, you're no longer in the realm of that domain of sense, you're in the realm of beings, basically, right? So to be able to think philosophically means a different kind of time and space, right? That can allow one to hear, to listen to you could say, the showing itself of being, right? And I think we see that articulated, the loss of I mean, it doesn't even occur to us to think non-operationally. In fact, it doesn't even occur to us that we are thinking operationally, let alone having a space in which we dedicate to actually, which is skole, the original notion of skole, which was at the beginning of the video, which I'm not covering here. Okay.
For sense making, for example, right? Or for, yeah. So, I asked this question to clarify further, to maybe get this across further. It's not a cutting off of what has been of tradition. It's not speak in labels of futurist, right? And futurismo in this sense of getting rid of tradition. But at the same time, we must go through it to see what it's tried to respond to. You might put this differently, I don't know. In order to arrive at a thinking in terms of Zuspiel, that something that plays itself to us, that then becomes our own. Because without this,
a matter of experiencing this ending of metaphysics, and to experience what it means that it ends in the form of the deployment of sciences, human sciences and natural sciences. And you know, those who say, well, okay, this is old and this is done and we get rid of it, I cannot think but that there is no experience of what is ending there at all, because as I said before, we consist of metaphysics, all of us, and not because we think about Kant or Aristotle, but because the sciences, the 100% of scientific notions and categories, and as I said, it's built in the objects that surround us. All of this is a result of metaphysics. So to say that, you know, we cut off, I mean, how could it means cutting ourselves away? I don't know how that is possible. Yeah. So the thing is that experiencing the ending of something means experiencing the origin into which this is falling back.
Yeah.
Okay, to experience, I want to say that again, to experience the ending of something is to experience the origin in which it came about, for which something new can emerge, right? Basically is what I'm hearing him say. So like the task here is to experience the shock and the abandonment of the being of beings as senselessness, to become oblivious to it, right? And experience it. And in experiencing it, the experiencing of which is, you could say, that which allows one to actually experience this ending of metaphysics, this actual abandonment of being, this forgetfulness structure in all of its insidiousness, which is at the same time the thinking, perceiving, experiencing that leads to the origin in which that which was lost arose from, and in dropping into that origin, the possibility of a new, something completely new that isn't metaphysical, it's something else, right? It's really rich, really rich.
And this means then, it means the experience of the ending of something is the experience of that origin, from which then something else can arise.
That's very important to say. This is that this coming into an end must specifically be experienced and brought into its own as well, in order not to be at this black wall of the future that some call, the end of history, etc., which we can see what happens if it's not taken seriously, this end, right? We've had this discussion about the distinction between analytical and continental philosophy.
So I just want to, so it is possible to not experience this end, or to not take it seriously. So taking seriously, right, is experiencing the end of this.
Analytical philosophy officially begins as a project that's ahistorical, not anti-historical, but ahistorical. That's doesn't look at the tradition, and is now back to analyzing the tradition, attaching isms to it, and discussing whether certain philosophers are deists or theists, or perhaps quasi-deists, or other isms. Quasi is always what comes in when Verlegenheit, embarrassment is at its peak. And it's quasi. L'estere e quasi, I remember that. But so I just want to try and get this across, because one of the ways that Heidegger is also being read, or this thinking, is that all of metaphysics is wrong. It's all nihilistic. We need to get rid of it. But on the other hand, just without Heidegger, without understanding where we are, we will continuously look back and be almost antiquarians, as Nietzsche would call it, or critical historians, incapable of understanding what's handed down and what is necessary to be delivered over to another epoch. Or it's just, it's almost like being glued in representations, and then truly in empty ideas, right? Because then it's ultimately just about pushing around abstract notions and isms and applying them to propositions. So it turns the entire tradition into an informational content that can be abstracted, and then it can be argued about ad infinitum for all eternity, but never. It doesn't become our own thinking. It's there's thinking against thinking. It's without thought.
Yeah, I would say it's a historical project. I mean, it's in the sense of Heidegger's distinction between Historia and Geschichte.
Yeah.
And if today it's true that we are historical animals, the historical animal is an end form of the Zoon, Logon, Echon, when the reference to Logos and all of this, and to time, when all of this vanishes, you have the historical animal, and the historical animal is the same thing. Here, historical means that has the animal that has a historical relation to things, and this is fundamentally a computational relation, a relation of computing in some way or another. What you were describing before in systematizing, and relating to the tradition, these are exercises of computation. And to compute is, as we know, is what animals can also do. So the historical animal is not just the animal part of the human being, but is because when the human being becomes an animal, that is different from what an animal is. The human being.
I think that's what mostly we call thinking now, is computation.
Can be brutal in a way. So that's, Heidegger also talks of the brutal animal, or the brutality of our time. This is only when the human being is so sort of careless with respect to what it is to be a human being, and the historical animal that just deals in this in this way, also with the tradition and so on. That is really a form of it's a form of brutality, a brutality which then also shows in many other domains. But I think the important point, we can say whatever we want about what is the right relation we need to have to the tradition, and not treat it this way, treat it that way, and so on. The point is that if we don't have, what before I referred to as that igniting experience, if we cannot also experience the pain in a way, and the shock of this needlessness in which we are, and of this lack of a point of freedom, then all of this remains, remains in a way abstract. It's like, we try to have the right attitude, but because we learn that it's supposed to be this way or that way, and that we need to respect the tradition or really take it seriously and so on. But it's all an external kind of attitude if we're not sincere in a way to begin with where we are as a humanity today.
So thinking today, genuine philosophical thinking, what I'm hearing is arises out of the sincerity which comes from the pain and the confrontation with the abandonment of being and the loss of sense, that we have to experience it. We have to actually encounter it, experience it. And out of that is the possibility of, well, actually, in allowing it, in some sense, I'm basically hearing a kind of grief, which makes a lot of fucking sense to me, man. Because it does seem to me, when I walk around, right, I just look at people walking around, right, it does feel to me that people are walking around in a kind of undistinguished, unrecognized grief. I mean, just go to Walmart, right, or a shopping center, or some kind of public place, and just watch people walk around. What are the possibilities that are speaking to them? Right? Where are they? What are they? Right? Like, are people actually having an experience of sense that kind of arises out of things, out of the center of things, right? All right. Bedtime for me. Good night. More later.